Before I tell you what happened at my wedding, I need you to understand one thing. The moment that changed my life forever lasted less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That's how long it took for the people I thought loved me to show me exactly who they really were. I was standing in the bridal suite, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car when my phone buzzed. It was my dad. "Sweetheart, I'm here." Just pulled up outside. Flight was a nightmare, delayed twice, then rerouted through Frankfurt. I looked like I slept in a dumpster, but I made it. I laughed, even though my hands were shaking. Because that was my dad, always making me laugh at the worst possible moments. "Just come inside, Dad. I don't care what you're wearing. I love you, baby girl. See you out there." I hung up and pressed the phone to my chest for a second. He made it. After a 7-country business trip that had him bouncing between Hong Kong, Dubai, and somewhere in Eastern Europe I could barely pronounce, he had gotten on a plane and come straight here. No hotel stop. No wardrobe change. No rest. Just my dad, doing what he had always done. Showing up. I didn't know that in less than 20 minutes, the man who had crossed continents to watch me get married would be standing in the middle of my wedding venue being pointed at like he was a criminal. And I didn't know that my fiancé, the man I had said yes to, the man I had planned a life with, would be the one pointing. Let me take you back a little, just so you understand the full picture. My dad was never the kind of father who coached my soccer games or helped me with homework at the kitchen table. He was the kind of father who sent voice messages from airports at 2 a.m. telling me he was proud of me. He was the kind of father who missed 3 of my birthday dinners but showed up at every single one of my performances, competitions, and graduations, sometimes literally running through the door as my name was being called. He built his business from nothing. I mean that literally. When I was very young, we lived in a small apartment where the heat didn't always work in winter. My dad worked night shifts, took calls in the parking lot of his first office because he couldn't afford a bigger space, and spent years being the guy nobody took seriously. Then something shifted. I was around 12 when I noticed the change. The apartment became a house. The house became something nicer. The calls he took stopped being frantic and started being calm, the kind of calm that comes when you're the one people are waiting on, not the other way around. By the time I was in high school, my dad was traveling internationally for work. By the time I was in university, I had stopped fully understanding what he actually did because every time I asked, he'd wave his hand and say, "I just connect people who need things with people who have things, sweetheart." He never talked about money. Never flaunted it. Never made it a personality trait. He still wore his ridiculous patterned jackets. He still carried that battered old travel bag he'd had for 15 years. He still laughed too loud at his own jokes. He was just my dad, and I loved him more than I had words for. My fiancé, Harper, came from a completely different world. His family had wealth the way some families have furniture, inherited, displayed, and never questioned. His mother had strong opinions about table settings, guest lists, and what kind of flowers were acceptable at a society event. His father moved in circles that included politicians, investors, and people whose names showed up in financial news. When Harper and I got engaged, his mother sat me down over tea and told me, very kindly, very firmly, that the wedding would need to reflect the family's standing. I smiled and nodded. I didn't fully understand what I was agreeing to. Within weeks, our small, meaningful celebration had been transformed into a production. 240 guests, a venue that had hosted 3 government galas, a florist flown in from another city, a seating chart that felt more like a diplomatic negotiation than a family gathering. Harper kept saying it was just how things were done in his family. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that underneath all the polish and performance, we loved each other, and that was what counted. I was wrong. And I think, somewhere deep down, I had been quietly wrong for a long time. My dad and Harper had never met in person. That still feels strange to say out loud. They'd spoken on video calls a handful of times, traded a few text messages, and Harper had always seemed perfectly warm and respectful. But schedules never aligned. My dad was always somewhere else, and Harper was always busy, and somehow 2 years passed without the two most important men in my life ever being in the same room. I told myself it would all come together at the wedding. I told myself that the moment Harper saw my dad walk in, he would understand everything I'd always tried to explain. That the traveling, the distance, the missed dinners, none of it meant my dad didn't love me. It just meant he was the kind of man who carried the weight of 100 responsibilities and somehow still found a way to carry me too. I believed that right up until the moment I heard the commotion from the hallway outside my bridal suite. One of my bridesmaids, my closest friend since college, cracked the door open and peered out. Her face changed instantly. That quick, careful blankness people put on when they're trying not to alarm you. "What's happening?" I asked. She turned back slowly. "I think someone's being asked to leave." My stomach dropped before my brain even caught up. I knew. I just knew. I pushed past her and stepped into the corridor, and that's when I saw it. My father, standing near the entrance of the venue, travel bag at his feet, jacket wrinkled beyond saving, looking around with the calm, slightly confused expression of a man who had walked into the wrong meeting and was trying to figure out how to politely correct the situation. And standing in front of him, chest puffed, voice carrying, was Harper. "I don't know who you are or who let you in," Harper was saying, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "but this is a private, curated event. If you're not on the list, you need to leave. Now." My dad looked at him for a moment. Then he looked past him and found me. His eyes were tired. Deep travel tired, the kind that lives in your bones. But when he saw my face, he smiled. Just slightly. Just enough. And something inside me broke completely open. Because Harper hadn't recognized him. Not from the video calls. Not from the photos I'd shown him. Not from 2 years of me talking about my father, like he was the most important person in my world. He hadn't recognized him, and instead of pausing, instead of asking, instead of giving this exhausted man the single moment of grace it would have taken to say, "Wait, who are you?" He had made a choice. In front of everyone. Loudly. Publicly. He had looked at my father's wrinkled jacket and his old travel bag and the lines on his face from 20 hours of flying, and he had decided exactly who my father was. And he had been wrong. So catastrophically wrong. I opened my mouth to speak. But before I could say a single word, my father reached into his pocket. And he pulled out his phone. "I'm just going to make a quick call," he said quietly, not to Harper, not to the crowd, just to himself really, in that soft, unbothered tone he used when he was already 3 steps ahead of a situation. I watched him dial. And I stood there in my wedding dress, in the middle of the most important day of my life, realizing that I had no idea what was about to happen. But I had the strangest feeling that everyone else was about to find out. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to know something. Were you ever in a moment where you could see exactly how something was going to end, but no one around you could? Because standing there in that hallway, watching my father make that quiet little phone call while Harper stood there looking smug, I could feel it. Something was coming. And it wasn't going to be quiet. If this story is already hitting different, hit that like button. It helps more people find this video. And subscribe if you're new, because trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from, and have you ever had someone underestimate someone you love right in front of you? I want to tell you something about my father that I never told anyone. Not my friends. Not even Harper. Something I kept close to my chest like a secret I wasn't sure I had the right to share. My father was the loneliest successful person I had ever known. People who build things from nothing carry a particular kind of quiet with them. It's not sadness exactly. It's more like distance. Like they spent so many years in survival mode, heads down, eyes forward, always moving, that by the time they finally arrived somewhere comfortable, they'd forgotten how to just be in a room without calculating it. My dad was like that. He could walk into a boardroom in Singapore and command it completely. I'd heard stories from his colleagues, people who'd watched him negotiate deals that other people said were impossible. He had a way of listening that made people feel like the only person in the room. A way of speaking that made complex things sound simple. But at my school plays? At parent-teacher evenings? At the few birthday dinners we managed to share, he was always slightly offbeat, laughing a second too late, reaching for conversation the way someone reaches for a word in a language they learned as an adult, correctly, but with visible effort. He loved me fiercely. I never doubted that. But loving someone and knowing how to be with them in ordinary life are two very different skills. My dad had mastered one and spent his whole life quietly struggling with the other. My mum left when I was 4. I don't have many memories of her. Just impressions, really. A particular perfume. A laugh that was too bright, the kind that sounds like it's performing for an audience. A general sense of warmth that evaporated so completely after she was gone that I sometimes wondered if I'd invented it. She left because my dad was still struggling then. His first company had collapsed. His second was barely breathing. They were living off savings that were disappearing faster than he could replenish them, and apparently, my mum had married the idea of who she thought he was going to be, not who he actually was in the middle of the trying. So she left. And my dad never talked about it. Not once. Not in anger, not in sadness, not in bitterness. If I asked about her when I was little, he'd get this careful expression on his face, like he was measuring every word, and he'd say something like, "Some people are only meant to walk with you for part of the journey, sweetheart." That doesn't make the time less real. It took me until I was an adult to realize that he'd been protecting me. Not from her. From the version of the story that would have made me feel like I wasn't enough to make her stay. That's the thing about my dad. He absorbed things. He took on pain quietly, redistributed it into something useful, and kept moving. He never asked for credit. He never needed the room to know what he'd done. And that quality, that absolute lack of need for recognition, was both the most admirable thing about him and the thing that made it so easy for people like Harper's family to look at him and see nothing. I was still standing frozen in that corridor when Harper's mother appeared. She was a composed woman, always composed, the kind of composed that looks like serenity but is actually just very expensive control. She wore it like a second skin, that composure. In the months I'd known her, I had never once seen her rattled. She took one look at my father, the travel bag, the wrinkled jacket, the tired eyes, and her own expression did something very small and very telling. It tightened. Not in anger. In something worse. Dismissal. Like she'd already processed him, categorized him, and filed him somewhere beneath her attention. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, directing the question at Harper. Not at my father. At Harper. "This gentleman doesn't appear to be on the guest list," Harper said. He'd lowered his voice slightly now that his mother was there, performing a different kind of authority, quieter and more dangerous. "I was just explaining that the venue is private." His mother nodded once. "Security is just outside. I can have someone, that's my father." My voice came out much steadier than I expected. Both of them turned to look at me. I was still in my dress. My hands were at my sides. I could feel the eyes of a dozen nearby guests swinging toward us like a slow tide. "That man," I said, keeping my voice completely level, standing right there, with the travel bag, who has been on a plane for nearly 20 hours to be here today, is my father. Silence. Harper blinked. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt, not yet, just recalibration. The rapid internal processing of someone who'd made a mistake and was already working on how to reframe it rather than simply acknowledge it. "I didn't," he started. "You didn't ask," I said. I wasn't shouting. I want you to understand that. I wasn't making a scene. I was just stating a fact the way you state facts when you've gone very, very still inside. You didn't ask who he was. You didn't check. You just decided. Harper's jaw tightened. "Sweetheart, I don't." One word. And something in my tone made him stop completely. My father, through all of this, had not moved. He was still standing in the same spot, phone in hand, watching. That calm hadn't left his face, that particular calm I'd grown up reading, the one that meant he was paying very close attention to everything while appearing to pay attention to nothing. He looked at me now and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Not now. Not here." I understood him instantly, the way you understand someone you've been reading your whole life. He wasn't asking me to forgive what had just happened. He was asking me to wait. And somehow, Despite the fact that my chest felt like it was caving in, I listened. Harper's mother recovered first. She was good at that, pivoting from discomfort into action without ever acknowledging the discomfort itself. "Well," she said smoothly, turning the full warmth of her social smile toward my father, "I do apologize for the confusion. Naturally, as the bride's father, you're more than welcome. Please, let someone take your bag." "I'll keep it," my dad said pleasantly. "Thank you." His tone was so easy, so utterly unbothered. Like he'd simply walked into a room where someone had spilled something, and everyone was now pretending the floor was dry. Harper's mother smiled tighter. "Of course. Can we get you something? Water?" "We have." "I'm fine." He smiled at her. Genuine, warm, completely unreadable. And she, for just a fraction of a second, didn't know what to do with him. Because he wasn't reacting the way he was supposed to. He wasn't flustered or grateful or relieved. He wasn't performing humility or embarrassment. He was just standing there, present and calm, like a man who had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone in this room. That quality, that specific quality, was the thing people who underestimated my father always missed. They mistook his stillness for weakness. They mistook his quiet for emptiness. They looked at the jacket and the old bag and the tiredness in his face, and they built an entire story about who he was. The problem was, they were building it with the wrong materials. My bridesmaid reappeared at my elbow, gently steering me back toward the suite with the practiced urgency of someone who understood that the next 15 minutes needed to run on schedule. I went. But I looked back over my shoulder before I turned the corner. My father was still standing in the corridor. Harper's father had appeared now, a tall, silver-haired man with the kind of handshake that tells you everything about how someone sees themselves, and he was speaking to my dad with the polished graciousness of a man performing generosity rather than feeling it. My dad was nodding, and there was something in his expression, something in the very slight curve at the corner of his mouth that I recognized. It was the look he got right before a deal changed. Not the moment when things got difficult. The moment when things got interesting. I didn't know it then. But that phone call my father had made, that quiet, 1-minute call while Harper stood there waiting for security, had already set something in motion. Something that couldn't be undone. And in about 45 minutes, when the ceremony was supposed to begin, everyone in that room was going to understand exactly who had been standing in that corridor in a wrinkled jacket. Everyone. But first, I had to walk down an aisle. And I had to make a decision. There's a moment, right before you do something you can't take back, where everything goes very quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that lives in the space between knowing something and admitting that you know it. I stood at the entrance of that aisle, bouquet in my hands, and I lived inside that quiet for what felt like a very long time. My bridesmaid was fixing the back of my dress. Someone was handing me my bouquet. Someone else was adjusting the small pearl pins in my hair. There was soft music drifting in from the ceremony hall, something classical, something Harper's mother had selected from a shortlist she'd emailed me 3 weeks before the wedding with color-coded tabs. I remember standing there and thinking, I didn't choose this music. And then thinking, how many other things didn't I choose? It's strange, the thoughts that come to you when everything is moving too fast for you to stop it. You don't think in complete sentences. You think in flashes, in images, in the feeling of something sitting wrong inside your chest that you've been calling nerves because it's easier than calling it what it actually is. I was gripping my bouquet too tightly. I could feel the stems bending. Breathe, I told myself. Just breathe. Let me tell you about the moment I said yes to Harper. We were in the city where we'd had our first proper date, a restaurant neither of us could afford at the time, back when we were still figuring out who we were to each other. He'd taken me back there 2 years later. Same table, same view. He'd had the staff set up something small and personal, candles, a note in his handwriting, my favorite flowers. It was thoughtful. It was the kind of gesture that tells you someone has been paying attention. I said yes immediately, before he'd even finished the question. I said yes because in that moment, I saw the man I believed him to be careful and attentive and warm, and I thought, this is it. This is the person. What I didn't understand then, what I only began understanding slowly, over the year that followed, was that Harper had two versions of himself. There was the version he showed me, and there was the version that came out when he was around his family. The first version was the man I fell in love with. Funny and curious, a little guarded but genuinely kind, someone who asked good questions and remembered small details and made me feel like the most interesting person in whatever room we were in. The second version was harder to love. The second version cared about what things looked like, about how situations reflected on him, about maintaining a certain image in front of people whose opinions he'd been taught to treat like currency. I had told myself those two versions were just context, that everyone behaved differently around family, that it didn't mean anything. I had been telling myself a lot of things I was beginning to realize. My father appeared at my side so quietly I almost startled. He'd changed. Somehow, in the 20 minutes since the corridor, he'd managed to find a fresh shirt, still simple, still not the kind of outfit Harper's mother would have approved of, but clean and pressed. He still had the old watch on his wrist, the one he'd worn for as long as I could remember, with the scratched face and the worn leather strap. He'd been offered a new one once, I knew. An expensive one, from a business partner who thought it would make a good gift. My dad had thanked him genuinely and kept wearing the old one. Sentimental, he'd told me once when I asked about it. Your grandfather gave me that watch the week I started my first company. He said, time is the only thing you can spend without getting back. I keep it to remind myself not to waste it. He looked at me now, standing beside me at the entrance of the aisle, and his eyes did that thing they always did when he was feeling something big and choosing not to perform it. They just went very, very still. You look like your grandmother, he said softly. On her wedding day. Same expression. What expression? He considered this for a moment. Like you're deciding something. I looked at him. He looked back at me. No pressure in his gaze. No agenda. Just that steady, ancient patience he'd always had, the kind you develop when you've sat across tables from difficult people for 30 years and learned that the one who stays calm longest usually wins. Dad, I said quietly, I'm so sorry. About what happened in the corridor. I should have. Stop. His voice was gentle but firm. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing that happened out there was your doing. But Harper, my father said carefully, is a man I don't know very well yet. He paused. But I'm learning. There was something in the way he said that last part. Not threatening. Not bitter. Just noting. Like a scientist adding a data point to a long observation. The music shifted. Somewhere inside the hall, the arrangement changed to the processional, and I felt the subtle movement around me, the bridesmaids beginning to line up, the coordinator appearing at the edge of my vision with her clipboard and her earpiece and her expression of serene professional urgency. 2 minutes, she said, looking at me. I nodded. My father offered me his arm. I looked at it for a second. That arm. The arm that had caught me when I fell off my bike at 7 years old. The arm I'd grabbed in airport arrival halls across 3 different countries over the years, spotting him in the crowd before he spotted me. The arm that had stayed steady through everything, through the lean years, through the distance, through every version of our complicated, imperfect, deeply real relationship. I took it, and we started walking. The ceremony hall was stunning. I'll give Harper's mother that. She had extraordinary taste. The flowers alone probably cost more than most people's rent, and they were worth every cent. Soft ivory and sage green, trailing down the ends of every pew, climbing the arch at the altar in cascading arrangements that looked almost impossible. The guests were turned in their seats, watching as I entered. 240 faces. Politicians. Investors. Socialites. Harper's extensive network of family, friends, and business connections, all dressed in their finest, all radiating the particular energy of people who attended events like this regularly enough that they'd perfected the art of looking important while appearing relaxed. I scanned the room without meaning to, and I noticed something. Harper's family side was full. Every seat packed, buzzing quietly with the low murmur of people who knew each other well and had much to discuss. My side was smaller. Close friends. A few relatives who'd traveled to be here. My dad's old business partner, a quiet man named Raymond who'd known our family for 20 years and had driven 4 hours to attend. The imbalance had never bothered me before. Suddenly it bothered me enormously. Harper was standing at the altar. He was beautiful, objectively. Tall, well-dressed, the kind of composed that photographs well. He was smiling, that warm, practiced smile he did so naturally that I'd spent months believing it was always genuine. As I walked toward him, he was looking at me. But just before I reached the halfway point of the aisle, his eyes slid, just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, to my father beside me. And I watched his expression do something. Not shift exactly. More like recalibrate. He'd recognized him now. Properly. Now that he was beside me in context, now that the picture was complete, he understood who he'd tried to have removed from his own wedding. He understood the mistake he'd made. And I watched him decide, in real time, that the best strategy was to simply move past it. No acknowledgement. No visible regret. Just the smooth, forward momentum of a man who had been taught that confidence was its own absolution. That if you carried yourself correctly, people would follow your lead and decide it hadn't happened. He held out his hand to receive me. And my father, my quiet, patient, still-water father, paused for just one moment before releasing my arm. He looked at Harper. Harper looked at him. My father smiled. Small. Genuine. Containing absolutely everything and revealing almost nothing. Then he placed my hand in Harper's, stepped back, and took his seat in the front row. And I stood at that altar and looked at the man I was about to marry and felt, for the first time with total clarity, the thing I'd been almost feeling for months. I don't fully know who you are. The officiant began to speak. Words I'd heard at other people's weddings. Words about commitment and partnership and choosing each other every day. Words that were beautiful in the abstract and felt, right now, like they were being spoken in a language I was rapidly forgetting how to translate. I kept my face still. I'd learned that from my father, I realized. That ability to keep the surface calm while everything underneath was moving fast. My hands were not shaking. But inside, something had already started to shift. Something that had started in a corridor with an old travel bag and a wrinkled jacket. Something that a single phone call had set into motion. And in about 30 minutes, when the ceremony ended and the reception began, the room was going to understand exactly what that phone call had been about. I stood at that altar and made a choice. But it wasn't the one everyone in that room thought I was making. There's a specific kind of performance that wealthy families put on at events like this. It's not malicious exactly. It's just practiced. Like a play that's been running so long, everyone has forgotten their acting. I had spent the last year learning my lines. Standing at that reception, champagne glass in hand, smile in place. I realized I had finally forgotten them completely. The reception was held in the garden wing of the venue. It was breathtaking, genuinely. String lights suspended between old stone pillars, long tables draped in ivory linen, crystal glasses catching the late afternoon light and scattering it in small, quiet rainbows across the tablecloths. A live quartet played something elegant in the corner. Waitstaff moved between guests with the silent efficiency of people trained to be invisible. Harper's mother had outdone herself. I stood at the entrance of it all, still in my dress, still holding my bouquet, still wearing the expression I'd carefully constructed during the ceremony, and I thought, this is beautiful. And then I thought, none of this is mine. Not the flowers I didn't choose. Not the music I didn't select. Not the guest list I'd had almost no hand in building. Not the seating chart that had been revised 4 times to accommodate the social hierarchies of people I barely knew. It was a beautiful event. It just wasn't my wedding. My father had found his seat at the family table. I watched him from across the room as Harper and I did our rounds, the obligatory circuit of greeting guests, accepting congratulations, performing the particular choreography of a couple who are deeply happy and want everyone to know it. My dad was talking to Raymond, his old business partner. They had their heads slightly together, the way people do when they're in genuine conversation rather than performing one. Raymond was saying something and my dad was nodding, that small smile on his face. He looked completely at ease. That bothered Harper's mother more than she was willing to show, I noticed. She was watching him too, from her position near the head table, champagne in hand, with the careful peripheral vision of a woman who monitored every social variable in a room simultaneously. Every time she looked at my father, something happened in her expression. Not dislike exactly. More like confusion. He wasn't behaving correctly. He wasn't fidgeting with his cutlery or looking around at the grandeur with wide eyes. He wasn't performing gratitude for being included or trying to insert himself into conversations with the important guests. He wasn't doing any of the things that someone of the status she'd assigned him should have been doing. He was just comfortable. Genuinely, deeply comfortable. In his simple shirt and his scratched watch, at a table surrounded by people in designer everything. My father looked like the most at-home person in the garden. And that, I was beginning to understand, was the thing about him that certain people would never be able to metabolize. Harper's hand found the small of my back as we reached a cluster of his father's business associates. "My wife," he said smoothly, drawing me in, and the word landed strangely. Wife. New and slightly too large, like a coat I hadn't tried on properly yet. The men in the group were the kind of men who existed in my peripheral awareness throughout the planning process, names on a guest list, faces at engagement dinners. People whose approval seemed to matter enormously to Harper's family without anyone ever explaining exactly why. One of them, older, silver-templed, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no in a professional context, smiled at me warmly. "Wonderful ceremony," he said. "Your family must be very proud." "My father is here," I said. He came straight from a business trip overseas. Barely had time to change. I don't know exactly why I said it. Maybe I was already starting to plan something. Maybe I just wanted to say out loud, to someone, that my father had crossed the world to be here. The man nodded politely. Harper's hand pressed slightly firmer at my back. A subtle, automatic pressure. The kind that says, let's move on without saying anything at all. I didn't move on. "He travels a lot," I continued pleasantly. "International business. He's based everywhere and nowhere, really. You might actually know some of the same people. He works across finance, investment, that kind of space." "Is that right?" the man said, with the mild interest of someone who is being polite. I smiled. "He's around somewhere. I'm sure you'll cross paths." Harper steered me gently away before I could say anything else. "What was that?" he murmured when we were out of earshot. His voice was low and controlled. The voice he used when he was managing something. "What was what?" I asked. "You were talking about your father to Callum's associates." "I was mentioning that my father is here. At my wedding. Is that unusual?" Harper's jaw shifted. "You know what I mean." "I really don't," I said softly. "Explain it to me." He looked at me for a moment, that rapid reassessment again. That recalibration. Then he produced a smile and leaned in to kiss my temple. "Let's just enjoy the evening," he said. And he guided me toward the next group of guests. I went. But something had changed in the way I was moving through this room. I was no longer simply attending my own wedding. I was watching it. The first sign that something was shifting came about 40 minutes into the reception. I noticed it because I'd been keeping a quiet eye on my father, not anxiously, just the way you track someone you love in a crowded space, that unconscious radar. He'd left the family table. He was standing near the bar now, and he wasn't alone. The man he was speaking to was one of the most prominent guests at the entire reception. I knew this because Harper's mother had mentioned him approximately 11 times during the planning process, a senior figure in an investment group that Harper's family had long-standing ties with. The kind of man whose presence at an event was considered a social endorsement. He and my father were deep in conversation. Not the polite, surface-level exchange of strangers at a party. Something real. Something that had clearly started somewhere familiar and was now going somewhere interesting. My father was leaning against the bar with one hand in his pocket, completely relaxed, and the other man was leaning toward him, that subtle physical tell of someone who is engaged, who is interested, who is finding the conversation valuable. My father said something. The man laughed. Genuinely. The kind of laugh that can't be performed. Then the man put his hand on my father's shoulder, briefly, warmly, and said something back. My father nodded. I watched Harper's mother notice this from across the room. I watched the expression on her face do something complicated. It happened again 20 minutes later. Different guest this time. A woman I vaguely recognized as someone connected to a government advisory board, the kind of connection Harper's father mentioned with careful casualness, because it was the kind of connection you were supposed to be impressed by. She had sought my father out, not the other way around. She had crossed the garden with purpose, touched his arm to get his attention, and when he'd turned and recognized her, something had passed between them, the warm, easy recognition of people who knew each other from somewhere real. Not as acquaintances, as colleagues, as equals. They embraced briefly. Then they sat down together at a small table near the edge of the garden, and they talked for a long time. I looked at Harper. He was watching too now. The pleasant social expression on his face had developed a small crack in it, barely visible, but I knew his face well enough to see it. Something was pulling at the edges of his composure. Something he couldn't quite name yet but could feel arriving. Harper's father appeared beside his son. They exchanged a few quiet words, and I watched something travel between them, information I realized. Something had been said to Harper's father. Something that had shifted his understanding of the room. He looked across the garden at my father. Then he looked at Harper. Then he looked at my father again. And his expression, the expression of a man who had spent decades reading social landscapes and adjusting accordingly, went through 3 distinct changes in about 4 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then something that looked uncomfortably like concern. I excused myself from the conversation I'd been performing and slipped toward the edge of the garden, where the stone wall was draped in trailing greenery and the noise of the reception softened slightly. My phone buzzed in the small clutch I'd been carrying. A message from Raymond, my father's old business partner. "Your dad wanted me to make sure you were okay. He says you have the same look on your face you had at your university finals. He says you're fine, but he wanted you to know he's here." I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I typed back, "Tell him I know. Tell him I'm watching." 3 dots appeared. Then, he says good. He says to keep watching. And he says he's proud of you. Whatever happens next. Whatever happens next. I looked back across the garden. My father was now being approached by a third person, one of the guests I'd seen Harper's parents treating with the particular deference reserved for people who held serious financial influence. This man didn't just greet my father. He stopped completely when he saw him, like someone who had walked into a room and found something they hadn't expected. He said something. My father responded. And then this man who Harper's parents had been performing for all evening, turned and looked across the garden with an expression that I can only describe as the look of someone putting together a puzzle they hadn't realized they were holding. He was looking at Harper's parents, and they had just noticed him looking. Something was unraveling. Quietly. There are things people keep from you because they want to hurt you. And there are things people keep from you because they love you so much that they'd rather carry the weight themselves than watch you bend under it. My father was always the second kind. I just didn't know how heavy the thing he'd been carrying actually was. It was Raymond who told me, not my father. My father would have found a way to soften it, to frame it, to hand it to me gently enough that I might have almost missed the sharpest edges. That was his way, not dishonesty, never that, but a particular kind of careful love that instinctively reached for the version of truth that would leave me most intact. Raymond was not like that. Raymond was a straight-line kind of man. Quiet, steady, economical with words in the way that people are when they've spent decades in rooms where every word costs something. He found me near the stone wall at the edge of the garden, slipping through the reception crowd with the purposeful invisibility of someone who had decided that something needed to be said and had appointed himself to say it. He sat down beside me at the small table I'd retreated to. He folded his hands on the tablecloth. And he said, "There's something you should know about Harper's company. I want to take you back 2 years. Harper's business, a mid-sized investment consultancy he'd built with 2 university friends, had been struggling. This was not a secret, exactly, but it also wasn't something Harper talked about openly. He mentioned it to me in passing once, early in our relationship, framing it as a temporary rough patch. A recalibration. The kind of thing that happened to every business and meant nothing about the people running it. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was confident about it. Calm. The way he was calm about most things, that practiced, surface-level serenity that I'd spent a year mistaking for genuine peace. What he didn't tell me was how bad it actually was. Raymond told me now, in the quiet at the edge of a garden full of celebrating people who had no idea what was being said at this small table. The company had not been in a rough patch. It had been weeks from collapse. 3 significant clients had pulled their investments within a 6-month period. A contract they'd been counting on had fallen through. Legal costs from a dispute with a former partner had eaten through their operating reserves. They were at the point where the 2 co-founders were having quiet conversations about how to wind things down with the least possible damage. Harper had not told me any of this. Not while it was happening. Not after it resolved. Not at any point in the 2 years since. How did it resolve? I asked Raymond, even though I already felt the answer coming toward me like weather. Raymond looked at me steadily. Your father, he said simply. The full shape of it came out slowly, piece by piece, the way Raymond spoke, measured and precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. My father had learned about Harper's company through his own network. He hadn't gone looking for it. It had simply arrived the way information always arrives when you move in certain circles long enough, through a conversation, through a mutual contact, through the quiet intelligence gathering that happens naturally when you've spent 30 years building relationships across industries. He'd looked into it. Not to interfere. Not to test Harper. But because he was my father, and the man I was in a relationship with was in serious trouble, and that was simply what my father did, he paid attention to things that mattered to the people he loved, and then he quietly did something about them. He'd come in as a silent investor. Not under his own name. Through one of his holding companies, a structure several steps removed from anything that would have made the connection obvious. He'd injected enough capital to stabilize the business, restructured 2 of their key client relationships through introductions he'd made behind the scenes, and helped them secure the contract that ultimately turned things around. Harper's company had survived because of my father. Harper didn't know it. His parents didn't know it. No one knew it except my father, Raymond, and the small number of people involved in the transaction who had signed agreements that kept the source of the investment confidential. Why? I asked. My voice was very quiet. Why didn't he tell me? Raymond was quiet for a moment. I asked him the same thing, he said. At the time, when he was putting it together. What did he say? Raymond looked out across the garden briefly, then back at me. He said, if I tell her, she'll carry it. She'll wonder if Harper loves her or the safety net. She'll question every moment between them. She'll never be able to just be happy without this thing sitting underneath it. Raymond paused. He said he'd rather carry it himself. I sat with that for a long moment. The noise of the reception continued around us, laughter, clinking glasses, the quartet moving into something slightly more upbeat. 240 people celebrating a marriage they had absolutely no idea was built, in part, on a foundation my father had quietly laid. The phone call, I said slowly. At the venue. When Harper tried to have him removed, Dad made a phone call. Raymond nodded. Who did he call? The lead contact at the holding company, Raymond said. Asked him to reach out to a couple of people here tonight. People who would recognize the connection. I thought about the senior investment figure who'd laughed at my father's joke at the bar. The woman from the advisory board who'd crossed the garden to embrace him. The third man, the one whose expression had shifted so completely when he'd seen my father standing there. They all knew, I said. Some of them, Raymond said. Enough of them. And Harper's parents are currently, Raymond said, with the careful precision of a man choosing words like a surgeon choosing instruments, becoming aware. I looked across the garden. Harper's father was no longer standing where I'd last seen him. He was at the far end of the reception space, near the entrance to the main building, and he was in conversation with the third man, the one whose expression had changed so dramatically when he'd spotted my father. They were speaking with the focused intensity of people who have moved past social performance entirely and into something urgent. Harper's father's face was doing something I had never seen it do in all the months I'd known him. It was uncertain. This was a man who moved through the world with the absolute confidence of someone who had never seriously questioned his own position within it. who had opinions about everything and delivered them as facts, who had, at various points in our relationship, made me feel subtly but consistently that I was a guest in a world he owned. He looked uncertain now. He looked like a man recalculating. And as I watched, he turned his head slowly and found my father across the garden. My father was still at his table, still with his simple shirt and his scratched watch. Still calm, still present. He wasn't looking at Harper's father. He was looking at me. I held my father's gaze for a moment. All those years of learning to read him, all those years of airport arrivals and rushed phone calls and patterned jackets and the particular way he had of making you feel, despite every absence, that you were the most important thing, came together in that single look across a garden full of people who had no idea what was moving through it. He raised his eyebrow slightly. "Are you okay?" I gave the smallest nod. "I'm okay." He tilted his head toward the reception, toward Harper, toward the glittering, expensive, carefully constructed evening around us. "What do you want to do?" And I realized that this was what he had always done. Not made decisions for me. Not rescued me. Not swooped in with the resources and the power and the connections and simply fixed everything while I stood to the side. He had laid the groundwork. He had been patient. He had waited. And now he was asking me, the way he had always ultimately asked me, what I wanted. I turned to Raymond. "Does Harper know yet?" I asked. About the investment. About who his silent investor actually was. Raymond glanced across the garden. "I think," he said carefully, "he's about to." I followed his eyeline. Harper's father had left the conversation with the third man and was now moving through the reception with quiet, controlled urgency, the body language of someone who has received information that requires immediate action and is trying not to let anyone see how much it has rattled them. He was heading toward Harper. Harper was standing with a group of friends near the center of the garden, champagne glass in hand, laughing at something, performing the ease of a man on the best day of his life. He didn't see his father coming. He didn't see the expression on his father's face. He didn't see any of what was moving toward him like a tide that had been building for 2 years, patient and quiet and absolutely inevitable. I watched his father reach him. I watched him lean in and say something low and private. I watched the laughter leave Harper's face. And I watched him turn slowly, like someone who already knew what they were going to see before they saw it, and look across the garden at my father. This was the moment where it could have gone one of several ways. Harper could have felt shame. He could have felt remorse. He could have crossed that garden and done the only thing that might have meant something. Simply walked up to my father and told him the truth about what he felt. But Harper was not that man. He was the other man. The one who appeared when things got difficult. And what he did next was the thing that made my decision for me completely. Harper crossed the garden toward my father. I watched it happen from where I stood with Raymond, still at the small table near the stone wall, still in my wedding dress, still holding the pieces of an evening that had been coming apart quietly for hours. The crowd between them was thick enough that I couldn't hear what was said. But I could see it. And sometimes seeing is more than enough. Harper's posture told me everything before a single word was spoken. He walked the way he walked when he was managing a situation, shoulders set, chin slightly lifted, the careful, controlled movement of a man who had decided on his approach before he arrived. Not coming to listen. Coming to land. My father stood up when he saw him coming. Not defensively. Just stood. The way you stand when someone is walking toward you and you want to meet them properly. Straight and open and completely unguarded. Harper stopped in front of him. There was a moment, just a breath, just a fraction of a second, where I thought, maybe this is the moment. Maybe knowing the truth had cracked something open in him. Maybe the man I fell in love with, the careful, attentive, genuinely curious man from the restaurant on our first date, was about to show up in this garden and say something real. Harper said something. My father listened. And then, very slowly, my father's expression changed. Not to anger. Not to hurt. To something quieter and more final than either of those things. Disappointment. I found out later what Harper had said. Not that evening. Days later, when the dust had settled enough for my father to tell me without either of us falling apart. Harper had not come to apologize. He had come to negotiate. Standing in front of the man who had quietly saved his company, standing in front of my father at my wedding, in a garden full of witnesses, Harper had looked at him and said, essentially, that he hoped they could keep the investment arrangement private. That there was no need for it to become a talking point. That naturally, they would discuss appropriate terms going forward, and he hoped they could handle it like businessmen. Like businessmen. Not like a son-in-law who had just discovered the magnitude of what had been done for him. Not like a man who had, an hour earlier, publicly humiliated the person who'd saved him. Like businessmen. My father had looked at him for a long moment. Then he'd said, very quietly, I think you should go speak to your wife. Harper had blinked. We can discuss the details of the arrangement at a more appropriate. Harper. My father's voice, Raymond told me later, had been completely calm. The kind of calm that fills a space entirely, leaving no room for anything else. Go speak to your wife. I didn't wait for Harper to reach me. I was already moving. Not away from him, toward the center of the garden, toward the open space where the reception was still humming. Where guests were still eating and drinking and existing in the pleasant bubble of a celebration that had no idea it was hovering over something fractured. I needed air that wasn't loaded with any one conversation. I needed a moment to think. Because here is what was happening inside me, underneath the stillness I'd been maintaining for hours. I was grieving. Not dramatically. Not with tears and shaking hands. I'd always been my father's daughter in that sense, a keeper of the surface. But deeply, quietly, I was grieving the version of this day I had imagined. The version where the music was playing and the flowers were perfect and the man at the altar was exactly who I'd believed him to be. I was grieving the Harper I'd fallen in love with. Because that Harper, the one who had been attentive and curious and warm, had either never fully existed or had existed in a context that couldn't survive contact with difficulty. And difficulty had arrived today. And he had failed it. Not in the small, forgivable way that people sometimes fail when they're surprised or scared. In the way that tells you something structural. The way that reveals what someone is actually made of when the layers of performance get stripped away. He had looked at my exhausted father in a wrinkled jacket and decided, instantly and completely, that he was beneath notice. And then, when he discovered who my father actually was, he had not led with shame. He had led with strategy. That was the man I had married. Harper found me near the edge of the reception, away from the main clusters of guests. He was wearing a different expression now than the one he'd had walking toward my father. That one had been controlled, strategic. This one was something I recognized from arguments we'd had, the particular expression he wore when he knew he was wrong, but hadn't yet decided how to admit it without losing ground. We should talk, he said. We should, I agreed. He glanced around, checking who was nearby. Old habit. Everything was always about who was watching. Not here, he said. Here is fine, I said. He looked at me. That recalibration again, that rapid internal adjustment that I'd been watching all day and finally had language for. He was deciding which version of himself to deploy. I owe your father an apology, he said. He said it carefully, like a man placing a piece on a board. Like an opening move. Yes, I said. You do. What happened earlier, he paused. Chose words. I didn't know who he was. If I had known. That's the part that matters to me, I said. He stopped. What? That's the part, I said quietly, that I keep coming back to. You didn't know who he was. You only knew what he looked like. And you made a decision based entirely on what he looked like. I made a mistake. You made a choice, I said. There's a difference. He was quiet. Around us, the reception continued its oblivious hum. Somewhere across the garden, the quartet had shifted into something softer. A waiter moved past us with a tray of desserts, giving us a wide, politely blind berth. I was trying to protect the event, Harper said, and I could hear him reaching for the reasonable version of what he'd done, the version that could be defended. My parents had worked so hard on this, and there were important people here, and You just decided, I said, that the man in the wrinkled jacket didn't belong. I didn't recognize him. Harper. I said his name the way my father had said it. Quietly. Completely. I had told you about my dad. Many times. I had shown you photos. You had spoken to him on video calls. And when he walked through that door looking tired from 20 hours of travel, you didn't try to recognize him. You didn't ask. You just acted. He opened his mouth, closed it. Something moved in his expression, something that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse, or might have been the recognition that the defense wasn't working. I couldn't tell anymore. I wasn't sure I'd ever been able to tell. What do you want me to say? He asked finally. I don't want you to say anything, I said honestly. I think I want you to listen. And then I told him. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Not in the way of someone who has been waiting for this moment and rehearsed it. I told him, in a low and steady voice, everything I'd been thinking since I stood at that entrance to the aisle and felt the wrongness of it settle into my chest. I told him that I had spent a year slowly accommodating, adjusting, shrinking the parts of myself that didn't fit neatly into the image his family needed to project. Agreeing to flowers I didn't choose and music I didn't select and a guest list built around connections rather than love. I told him I had told myself it was compromise. That marriage was about compromise. I told him I understood now that there was a difference between compromise and disappearing. I told him that when he had stood in that corridor and looked at my father, who had crossed the world for me, who had quietly saved the very company that funded this wedding without ever asking for a single thing in return, and decided he was nothing. That was the moment I understood that no version of compromise was going to fix what I was looking at. Because you can compromise on flowers. You cannot compromise on who a person fundamentally is. Harper was very still. The practiced composure had left his face. What was underneath it was younger and less certain and, in some ways, more real than anything I'd seen from him all day. Are you saying, he started? I'm saying, I said carefully, that I need you to understand what today actually was. Not the version you're going to tell people. The actual version. And what happens after that? He asked. His voice had lost its management. It was quieter now. Something in it that might have been real. I looked at him for a long moment. I don't know yet, I said honestly. And that was the truest thing either of us had said all day. I left him standing there and walked back through the reception toward the family table. My father was there. Raymond had gone to get drinks. My dad was sitting alone for a moment, looking out at the garden with an expression I knew, the private, unperformed face he wore when he thought no one was watching. He looked tired. Not the travel tired from earlier. Something deeper. The tiredness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for 2 years and had finally put it down and was now feeling the full weight of what it had been. I sat down beside him. He looked at me. I looked at him. We sat like that for a moment, just the two of us, in the middle of 240 people, in the most public and private conversation of my life. I know, I said softly. About the investment. About all of it. He nodded slowly. Not surprised. Not defensive. Just receiving it. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, he said. I understand why you didn't, I said. That doesn't mean it was the right call. No, I agreed. But it was a loving one. He looked at me for another long moment. Then he reached over and put his hand over mine on the tablecloth. That was all. No speech. No explanation. No performance of emotion. Just his hand over mine. My father, who had spent 30 years moving between countries and boardrooms and airports, who had built something extraordinary from nothing and never once made it anyone else's burden to know. Just his hand over mine. And I thought, this is what I come from. This is what they couldn't see when they looked at the jacket and the bag and the tired eyes. This is what they missed. But the evening wasn't over. It started with his mother. I should have anticipated that. In every difficult moment throughout our relationship, it had started with his mother. Not because she was a villain, she wasn't, not exactly. She was simply a woman who had spent her entire life constructing a world according to a very specific set of rules, and who responded to any threat to that world with the swift, decisive energy of someone protecting something they considered sacred. Her world was image. Her temple was reputation. And my father, quiet, present, completely unbothered, had walked into her temple in a wrinkled shirt and started conversations that were rearranging the furniture. She found Harper about 20 minutes after I'd left him standing at the edge of the reception. I was back at the family table with my father, and I had a clear sightline to the moment she reached her son. I watched her arrive with the purposeful grace of a woman who had made a decision. She touched his arm, said something low and quick. Harper listened, and something moved through his expression, something I recognized as relief. Relief. As if she'd offered him a way out of the conversation we'd just had. As if her arrival was a rescue. I watched him straighten. I watched the uncertain, younger, more real version of his face, the one that had appeared when I'd spoken honestly to him, get packed away. And I watched the managed version return. They came to the family table together. Harper and his mother, moving through the reception with the coordinated intention of people who had silently agreed on an approach. His father was somewhere behind them, I noticed, slightly further back, slightly less certain. Whatever information had reached him earlier in the evening had not fully resolved into a strategy yet. He was still recalibrating. Harper's mother was not recalibrating. She had calibrated and was now executing. She stopped at the edge of our table and produced a smile, wide, warm, the full wattage version she reserved for situations that required maximum social management. "I've been meaning to come and properly introduce myself," she said to my father, in the voice she used when she was being gracious. Generous. The voice of someone conferring attention as a gift. "We got off to such a confused start earlier. I do hope you'll forgive the misunderstanding." My father looked at her. He smiled back, that small, genuine, utterly unreadable smile. "Nothing to forgive," he said pleasantly. She blinked. Just slightly. She'd been prepared for something to work against, some residual tension she could charm her way through. His complete lack of grievance disarmed her in a way that visible anger wouldn't have. "You're too gracious," she said, recalibrating smoothly. "Truly. And I understand you've had quite the journey to be here. International travel is just exhausting, isn't it? All those hours." She gave a light, sympathetic laugh. "I always say, the things we do for family." My father said. One syllable. Warm. Agreeable. Containing nothing she could use. She held the smile. Adjusted her approach. "I'd love to hear more about your work," she said. "Harper tells me you're in business?" "Investments." The slight upward inflection at the end, not quite a question, not quite a statement, was the sound of someone trying to determine a number without asking for it directly. "Various things," my father said pleasantly. "How wonderful. It keeps me busy." "I imagine it does." She laughed again, lighter this time, recalibrating again. "Well, we must have a proper conversation over dinner sometime." "My husband would love to." "That would be lovely," my father said. And then he looked at Harper. Just looked at him. Directly. Calmly. The way he'd looked at him in the corridor, without anger, without performance, with that particular quality of attention that made people feel simultaneously seen and assessed. Harper met his eyes for approximately 2 seconds. Then he looked away. That look told me everything. Because Harper was not a coward, exactly. He was many things, image-conscious, strategic, occasionally unkind in ways he didn't fully register as unkind, but he wasn't someone who shied away from confrontation as a rule. He looked away from my father because he could not hold that gaze and maintain the version of himself he was currently performing. And he chose the performance. Right there, right then, with the evidence of everything sitting plainly between them, he chose the performance over the truth. That was the wrong choice. Not for the reasons you might think. Not because it was dishonest, though it was. Not because it was cowardly, though it was that too. Because it told me, with absolute finality, that when Harper was faced with a moment that required him to be genuinely accountable, to stand in discomfort and not reach for the managed version, he would always reach for the managed version. And I could not build a life on that. The wrong choice came in full form about an hour later. The reception had moved into its later stages, the formalities done, the speeches delivered, the carefully curated playlist from Harper's cousin taking the energy somewhere looser and more celebratory. Some guests had drifted to the dance floor. Others had gathered in smaller clusters, the deeper conversations that happen when people have had enough champagne to stop performing and start talking. Harper's father had apparently finished his recalibrating. He found my father near the bar, the same spot where the senior investment figure had laughed at my dad's joke hours earlier, and he had a conversation with him that lasted nearly 15 minutes. I was too far away to hear it. But Raymond was closer, and he told me later. Harper's father had been in his way, attempting something. Not quite an apology, more like a repositioning. An acknowledgement that there had been a misunderstanding, combined with a smooth pivot toward the future and what it might hold, professionally speaking. He'd mentioned the investment. He'd mentioned Harper's company. He'd mentioned, with the careful casualness of a man dangling something he thinks is valuable, that there might be significant opportunity in a closer relationship between their families going forward. My father had listened to all of it. Then he'd said, "I appreciate that." Truly. A pause. "But I think the more important conversation tonight needs to happen between your son and my daughter." Harper's father had looked at him. And I think my father had continued, with that same quiet completeness, that conversation should happen without either of us in the room. Harper's father had not known what to do with that. He'd nodded, murmured something agreeable, and walked away looking, Raymond said, like a man who had gone fishing and come back with something he hadn't expected to catch. Harper found me on the edge of the dance floor. The wrong choice, when it came, was this. He took my hand, led me onto the floor, and in front of everyone, in front of 240 guests, in the middle of our wedding reception, with the string lights overhead and the music soft and the evening golden in the way that expensive evenings are engineered to be golden. He performed. He held me close and moved slowly and put his mouth near my ear and said, "I love you. Whatever happened today, I love you. And we'll figure out the rest." It was the right words. It was the right gesture. It was exactly what the moment called for aesthetically, romantically, cinematically. And it was entirely, completely wrong. Because he hadn't answered the question I'd asked him. I hadn't asked him if he loved me. I had asked him, in the most honest conversation we'd ever had, to understand what today actually was. To sit in the truth of it without managing it. To look at what he'd done, not the misidentification, not the mistake, but the choice underneath it, the values that had driven it, and to reckon with it. And instead of reckoning, he had taken me onto the dance floor. He had made it a moment. He had turned it into something that looked, from the outside, like reconciliation. And everyone watching would see a couple moving slowly together in the golden light and think, "Isn't that beautiful?" I danced with him. I want to be honest about that. I didn't pull away. I didn't make a scene. I danced with him, and I let the moment exist as it existed, and inside it I was somewhere very still and very clear. I was thinking about my father's question in the corridor. Not the words, he hadn't used words. Just the look. The tilt of his head. "What do you want to do?" I knew what I wanted to do. I had known since I stood at the altar and watched Harper's eyes slide to my father and recalibrate. Since I'd watched him choose strategy over accountability in front of my father's table. Since he'd taken my hand and led me onto this dance floor and made beauty out of something that needed truth. I knew. I just needed one more thing before I did it. The song ended. Harper pulled back slightly and looked at me. There was something genuine in his face in that moment. I want to give him that. Something that was trying to reach across the distance between us and find me. "Are we okay?" he asked quietly. I looked at him. This man I had said yes to in a restaurant with candles and my favorite flowers. This man who had two versions of himself and had shown me the wrong one all day. This man whose company existed because my father had quietly, selflessly, lovingly made sure it did. "I need to go speak to my dad," I said. Harper's expression shifted. "Now." "Yes," I said. "Now." I stepped back from him gently. No anger in it. No performance. Just a step back. And I walked across the dance floor, through the warm golden light, past 240 guests who were still existing happily in the version of this evening they understood, toward the only person in the room who already knew what I was about to say. My father was standing near the edge of the garden. He had his hands in his pockets. He was looking up at the string lights, at the sky above them, at whatever a man looks at when he is standing at the end of something significant and letting himself feel the full weight of it. He heard me coming and turned. And, before I could say a single word, He opened his arms. I walked into them the way I had walked into them at airports and graduations and every complicated moment in between. And standing there in my wedding dress, in the middle of a reception that was still humming beautifully behind us. I told my father what I had decided. He held me tighter. And he said, into my hair, in the quiet voice he used when it was just us, "I know, sweetheart. I've been waiting for you to get there. And I'm so proud of you." I dried my eyes before I turned back toward the reception. Not because I was ashamed of them, but because what I was about to do required the same thing my father had always required of himself in difficult rooms, a surface calm that gave nothing away before it was time to give something away. My father straightened beside me. He offered me his arm, the same arm from the aisle, the same gesture, but carrying something different now. Not "I'm giving you away." More like "I'm walking with you. Where you go, I go." I took it, and we walked back into the reception together. The first person to notice was Raymond. He was standing near the family table, drink in hand, and when he saw us coming, my father and I, side by side, with whatever was written on our faces, he set his glass down very carefully. He gave my father a look. My father gave him the smallest nod. Raymond exhaled. Then he nodded back, and something in his posture changed, relaxed, almost. Like a man who had been waiting for a particular outcome and had just learned it had arrived. The second person to notice was Harper. He was still near the dance floor, talking with a group of friends, and he saw me the moment I stepped back into the main space. His eyes found me immediately, that particular attentiveness he had when he was tracking a situation, and I watched him read something in my expression that made the conversation he was in stop mattering to him. He started moving toward me. I kept walking. Harper's mother intercepted me first. Not deliberately, or perhaps deliberately, in the way that certain people are always exactly where they need to be to manage outcomes. She appeared at my side near the edge of the dance floor with that composed warmth she wore so well, and she touched my arm lightly. "You look like you need a moment," she said, in a voice calibrated to sound like concern. "All the emotion of the day catching up with you?" I looked at her. This woman who had spent months constructing an event around an image, who had looked at my father in a corridor and filed him away as irrelevant, who had come to our table earlier with her full wattage smile and her careful questions about investments and various things, trying to determine a number, trying to locate my father on a map she understood. She was still trying. Even now. "Actually," I said, "I was just going to find Harper. I need to speak with him." "Of course," she said warmly. "Though perhaps after the cake? We're just about to." "Now," I said, "if you don't mind." The warmth didn't leave her face, but something behind it shifted. She recognized the tone. It was the tone of a woman who had stopped asking permission. Harper met me halfway across the reception. We stood facing each other in the middle of the party, guests moving around us, music playing, the whole carefully constructed evening continuing its golden performance, and I looked at him and felt, for the first time all day, completely settled. Not happy, not angry, settled. The way you feel when you have stopped fighting the truth and simply let it be what it is. "We need to talk properly," I said. "Not here. Not in front of everyone." He nodded quickly. Relieved, I think, that I was initiating. That it looked like a couple having an important conversation rather than whatever he feared it looked like. We found a small room off the main corridor, one of the venue's side spaces, used for storage during events, quiet and plain and completely removed from the performance of the evening outside. I closed the door. I told him clearly, not cruelly, not with the kind of calculated precision designed to wound, but with the same honesty I'd offered him at the edge of the reception earlier, except more complete now, more final. I told him that I had spent the day watching him make choices. Small ones and large ones. The choice not to pause before having my father removed. The choice to come to my father not with remorse, but with strategy. The choice to take me onto the dance floor and make something beautiful out of something that needed to be sat with. I told him that each of those choices had told me something real about who he was when difficulty arrived. I told him that I was not angry about who he was. I was not interested in punishing him for it. But I could not build a life with someone whose instinct, in every hard moment, was to manage the appearance of the thing rather than the thing itself. I think I said that we want different things. Not just from each other. From life. From who we get to be in it. Harper was quiet for a long moment. The managed expression was gone now. Completely. What was underneath it was tired and young and genuinely lost in a way I found painful to look at. I made mistakes today, he said. Yes, I said. People make mistakes. They do, I agreed. And then they reckon with them. Genuinely. Not as a strategy, genuinely. I'm trying to. Harper. Quietly. Completely. You came to my father to protect a business arrangement. That was your first instinct. Not guilt. Not shame. Protection of an asset. He flinched. It was small. But it was real. And the fact that it was real, the fact that somewhere under all the management there was a person who could still flinch, made this harder, not easier. What are you saying? He asked. His voice very quiet now. I'm saying, I said carefully, that I think we both deserve more honesty than we've been giving each other. And I think the kindest thing I can do for both of us is to stop performing something that isn't true. The silence between us held everything. All of it. 2 years of it. The restaurant on the first date. The proposal. The planning and the flowers and the music and the guest list and the corridor and the dance floor. All of it, sitting in a quiet room while 240 people drank champagne outside. I love you, he said. I know, I said. But that's not enough. It wasn't a question. Not by itself, I said. No. I won't tell you that he took it gracefully. He didn't fall apart either. Harper was not a man who fell apart, that much I knew about him with certainty. But he sat with it, there in that plain little room, in his wedding suit, and for a few minutes, he was simply a person sitting with something painful. No management. No recalibration. Just sitting with it. I think that was the most honest I ever saw him. I think if that version of him had shown up more often, things might have been different. But it hadn't. And they weren't. And we sat in that room until the sitting was done, and then I stood up and I smoothed my dress and I said, I'm going to go back out there. I think you should take a few minutes. He nodded. I opened the door. For what it's worth, he said behind me, your father he's remarkable. I paused in the doorway. I know, I said. I should have seen it sooner. Yes, I said. You should have. And I walked out. It happened in the way my father had set it in motion. Quietly. Thoroughly. Through conversations that had already happened and information that had already moved and people who had already begun to understand what they were looking at. By the time I returned to the reception, the atmosphere had changed in a way that was difficult to name, but impossible to miss. Harper's parents were no longer the unchallenged center of gravity in the room. The guests who had spent the evening orbiting them, the investors, the political connections, the elite family friends, had redistributed. Several of them had found their way to my father's table over the course of the evening, drawn by conversations that had started at the bar and the edge of the garden and wherever my father happened to be standing. And my father, in his simple shirt and his scratched watch, had received them the way he received everything, with complete, unhurried ease. No performance of importance. No leveraging of position. Just genuine conversation, genuine interest, genuine presence. The thing he had always done. The thing that had built everything he'd built. The thing that certain people only recognized once someone told them what to look for. Harper's mother watched this from her position near the head table. I watched her watch it. And I saw the moment, precise and quiet, when she understood that the landscape of this room had shifted, and she had not been the one to shift it. She had spent months building something she believed was a monument to her family's standing. And my father, in one evening, in a wrinkled shirt, had simply reminded the room what actual standing looked like. Not performed. Not curated. Not constructed from guest lists and florists and the right connections in the right seats. Earned. That was the difference. And it was not lost on anyone paying attention. Harper's father approached my father one final time that evening. I was close enough to hear this one. He came without his wife. Without his son. Without the social armor of the evening. Just a man, tired and slightly diminished, standing in front of another man he had underestimated catastrophically and was now trying to find his footing with. I owe you an apology, he said. direct. No preamble. My father looked at him. What happened this morning, the way you were treated? It's done, my father said. I need you to know that it wasn't. I know, my father said. It was assumption. People make them. A pause. The question is always what you do once you understand the assumption was wrong. Harper's father was quiet. What would you like me to do? He asked. My father considered this genuinely. Not performing consideration, actually thinking. Be honest with your son, he said finally. About what you saw today. Not the business part, the rest of it. The part that actually matters. Harper's father nodded slowly. And my daughter, my father added, very quietly. Whatever comes next, she deserves honesty too. From everyone in her life. A long silence. You're a good father, Harper Sr. said finally. My father smiled. That small, genuine smile. I try, he said simply. That's all any of us can do. I found my father afterward as the reception began its slow wind down. Guests were leaving in clusters, collecting their things, exchanging the final embraces and promises to catch up that mark the end of events like this. The string lights were still beautiful. The flowers were still perfect. The evening had been, by every external measure, a stunning success. I sat beside my father and we watched it all together for a little while. I'm not staying married, I said. I know, he said. I know you know. He smiled. Are you okay? He asked. I thought about this honestly. I will be, I said. I think I'm more okay than I've been in a while, actually. Isn't that strange? No, he said. That's what happens when you stop carrying something that was never yours to carry. I looked at him. Like you did, I said. For 2 years. With Harper's company. He was quiet for a moment. I'd do it again, he said. Not for him. For you. Because you were happy, and I wanted you to stay happy, and I thought he paused. I thought he was going to be the kind of man who deserved you. He's not, I said. No, my father agreed, without bitterness. But he might become someone better. Difficult days have a way of doing that to people. If they let them. I leaned my head against his shoulder. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. We just sat there, my father and I, in the wreckage and the beauty of the most complicated day of my life, and let the quiet hold us. Here is what I know now, on the other side of it. Status is not what you wear. It is not your guest list or your venue or the flowers you had flown in from another city. It is not the number in your account or the names you can drop or the image you have spent decades carefully constructing. Status, real status, is what remains when all of that is stripped away. It is the person who crosses the world in a wrinkled jacket because their child is getting married. It is the hand placed over yours on a tablecloth without a single word. It is the phone call made quietly, without drama, without announcement, simply because the truth needed to arrive. My father never told anyone what he had done for Harper's company. He never leveraged it. Never used it as currency. Never asked for recognition. He had simply seen someone his daughter loved in trouble, and he had quietly made sure that trouble didn't become something worse. That is not a business decision. That is a father. And the people in that room who had looked at his jacket and his old bag and his tired eyes and decided he was nothing, they spent the rest of that evening understanding, slowly and completely, exactly what nothing looked like. It didn't look like my father. It never had. As for me, I left that wedding lighter than I arrived. Not happy, not yet. But clear. Clear in the way you become when you finally stop performing a version of your life and start living the actual one. My father flew out 3 days later, another trip, another country, another meeting in a city I'd need a map to find. But before he left, he sat across from me at a small table in my kitchen, drinking coffee from a mug that didn't match anything else in the cupboard, and he said, "Whatever you build next, build it yours. Not anyone else's version of it. Yours." I told him I would. And I meant it. Because I am my father's daughter. I know how to start from nothing. I know how to be quiet when quiet is the most powerful thing in the room. And I know with absolute certainty now, that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone like me is underestimate what I come from. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt true to something you've lived or witnessed or carried, hit that like button. It costs you nothing and it means everything for this channel. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because I have more stories. Stories about women who were underestimated. Women who were quietly, completely, devastatingly right. And the moments when the world finally had to admit it. And drop a comment, I read every single one. Tell me, has someone ever underestimated you or someone you love based purely on appearances? What happened when they found out the truth? I want to hear your story. And if you're ready for another one right now, click the next video. Thank you and have the most splendid day.